Good evening. Today on Heartbeat, we'll be discussing COVID-19 vaccines. I'm Arlana Shikongo, and welcome to the Namibian second episode of the Heartbeat live stream. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Theo-Ben Kandetu, who is the head of case management for the National COVID-19 Task Force. Dr. Kandetu, thank you for joining us and welcome.
Thank you for having me.
How are you doing today?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. Let's get right into this discussion about COVID-19 vaccines. As we know, there have been a lot of conspiracy theories, a lot of worries from the population, locally and globally, about what it means to get the COVID-19 vaccine. So let's have a little bit of a discussion about the various vaccines for COVID on the market, their efficacies, what it means to get it, and how it might affect people, and of course to dispel any myths that might exist since there are so many of them. So to start, let's just talk about the various ones that are on the market. We have the Pfizer vaccine, we've got Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, all of which have different efficacies, have to be stored in different ways. If you can just give us a little bit of insight into those. Let's start there.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. And again, good evening to the viewers and the listeners out there. So, as you've correctly said, there are a number of vaccine products on the market right now. To try and expand a little bit on them, I would like to classify them first and foremost based on how these vaccine products work to elicit a specific immune response. So essentially there are three main platforms or classes of vaccines out there. The first one is the mRNA platform or class of vaccine. We also have adenovirus vector. We also have the protein subunit. So these are basically just classes, as I've mentioned, and they aim to sort of illustrate how the vaccine works. So all the respective vaccines in that specific class work in a similar manner to perform or to elicit a specific immune response.
Okay.
So if we are looking at the mRNA vaccines, examples of these include the Pfizer, BioNTech, and the Moderna vaccines. Examples of adenovirus vectors include the AstraZeneca, the Johnson & Johnson, as well as the Sputnik 5.
Okay.
And an example of a protein subunit vaccine would be the Novavax.
Okay.
Yes. So having classified these vaccines now, it's also important for us to appreciate the different characteristics, right? Because of the fact that they don't all work in the same way.
Yeah.
They would not have the same characteristics. Of course, they still have the central role of eliciting an immune response. So if we're looking at Pfizer, one of the biggest things that we look at in terms of characteristics that stands out from the other vaccines is the cold storage requirements. Specifically with Pfizer, it requires what we call ultra cold storage requirements, and that's basically to say that the vaccine needs to be stored at least minus 70 degrees Celsius. So that is quite some hectic infrastructure that a country needs to be able to store the Pfizer vaccine. Still looking at now the cold storage requirements across the vaccine products. The Moderna requires minus 20 degrees, so that's not as bad, if I can call it that, as Pfizer. It wouldn't require as much infrastructure to be able to store that.
But still relatively cold, no?
But still quite
still
cold.
Quite cold,
yes.
Yeah. Okay.
although still within our capacity
Okay.
in Namibia to keep it stored
Okay.
at that temperature. Moving on now to the other classes I've mentioned, the AstraZeneca, the Johnson and Johnson, they require to be stored at between 2 to -8 degrees Celsius. Again, still in keeping with the infrastructure capabilities in Namibia. So that's one of the characteristics, cold storage, or the cold chain. Another thing that we need to appreciate in terms of characteristics is the dosage. So I think across the board, most of the vaccines require 2 doses for you to complete the course. Except for Johnson and Johnson. I think at the moment, that's the only exception where that one just requires 1 dose to complete the course, which of course is a plus, considering how many patients we may lose to follow up just after the first dose. So it would be good, for us to have a vaccine that just requires one dose. It's less labor intensive, and it would ensure that compliance, for people to come and get vaccinated and then be protected against COVID-19 infection. So in a nutshell, those are some of the vaccine products out there on the market, and I've highlighted just a little bit on the characteristics among the respective vaccine products.
Okay. Going back to the chemical makeup of the various vaccines, I know that there is a lot of concern that some of these vaccines contain the active coronavirus that they inject into your body, which a lot of people are fearful of in terms of, what if you inject it into my body and then I get the coronavirus itself rather than building up antibodies towards it. So could you maybe give us a little bit of an explanation of how the process of creating a vaccine using a small portion of the virus works to help the body build up those antibodies to actually fight the virus itself rather than contract it?
Okay, so that's a very important question, and I want to take some time just to expand on a few scientific concepts, and I'll try and be as non-technical as possible. So looking at the various vaccine products, as I've highlighted, they all have unique characteristics. They don't all work in the same way, but they do still elicit the same immune response, the desired immune response that is needed to protect us from COVID-19 infection. Okay. If we are just looking at the mRNA, as you have alluded to, the mRNA vaccines is how they work is essentially the mRNA is like a blueprint, right? All it does is it has within it a certain message or signal that would signal the host cell once it is inoculated into the person. It would signal the cell to it would signal the cell. I'm sorry.
No, you're fine.
Yeah.
I think if I'm understanding it, it's almost like it's giving it like a message, like a coding of some sort.
Yes.
No?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm sorry. I'm trying to use non-technical words, but my vocabulary is failing me. Okay. So I will have no choice, unfortunately, but to just use the technical jargon. Okay. So essentially what this mRNA does is it has the signal within it that signals the host cell to produce a non-lethal or inactive form of or portion of the COVID-19 virus.
Okay.
So what that means is this mRNA vaccine, once it is in the host cell, it will stimulate the cell to produce that portion, that harmless portion of COVID-19. And that harmless portion of COVID-19 we refer to as the antigen.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So that is essentially the what we call the spike protein, which is found on the surface of COVID-19. So that's what mRNA does. It is the blueprint, and it gives a signal. It gives a message for the host cell to stimulate that host cell to produce that spike protein, that antigen.
Okay.
So once that happens, this then leads to the body then mounting an immune response, because now the body has noticed that, okay, there's a foreign agent, there's a foreign body in the way of a spike protein, you know, in the way of an antigen that doesn't look like all of us, you know, it looks different. And so because it doesn't look like all of us, it looks different, the body recognizes it then, or the immunity recognizes that as a potentially dangerous thing that needs to be eliminated.
Okay.
And so that then signals the body's immune response to launch an attack on this antigen, right, on the spike protein. And part of that immune response is producing cells like antibodies, cells like T helper and T killer cells. Essentially, that would then lead to you know, the immune response. Now, once that happens, the body now is equipped to fight off COVID-19 should that specific person be infected. The good thing about this type of sensitization for the immune system is that it allows the body to equip itself, you know, to build protection against the enemy, which is COVID-19, without the person actually then having the risk of falling ill.
Okay.
Yeah. So that is a very important distinction to make. Now, to your point, as you've heard me explain, mRNA vaccines are not COVID-19, right? It's just a message, a signal, a blueprint by which the host cell gets a signal to stimulate it to produce this antigen, and then as a response to that, the body's immune system then launches an attack against this antigen in the way of antibodies and all these other immune cells.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Pfizer and Moderna both have a 95% efficacy, so I guess it's working pretty well. You know, the body is building up those antibodies and fighting this COVID-19 enemy. So then how does this compare to the other variations, which are, for example, not quite you know, the genetic coding kind of process that you were explaining, but more I think they call it the genetically modified virus. What is the difference, or is it similar? Can you explain that to us?
Okay, so one of the other vaccine platforms, right, is the adenovirus vector. So it sort of works similar to mRNA, only with adenovirus vectors. this is essentially, again, a harmless portion of another virus, not COVID-19. It's another virus sort of within the same genetic family, if I can call it that.
Okay.
That then also, once it is inoculated into the host, causes the cell to again produce that spike protein.
Okay.
That antigen.
Okay.
Yes. And then after that happens, as you know, with the mRNA vaccines, the body's immune system kicks in because it recognizes that this is a foreign agent. And so we need to conduct ourselves in a manner to eliminate the foreign agent, as I've explained.
Okay. Well, now that we have a little bit of an understanding of what's on the market, I think it would be worth it to discuss what would potentially be coming to Namibia, and why these are, the variations that were chosen for our demographic. If I'm not mistaken, we should be getting AstraZeneca, Sputnik from Russia, and I think is it the Sinovac? Yeah, the Sinovac from China. No, Japan. I believe those are the three that are kind of being talked about right now. I don't know which one is the official one coming from COVAX, but it's probably the AstraZeneca one, because I think that's also what's been going to the other African countries. But in terms of efficacy and our ability to store, why are those the ones that are being given to our population specifically?
Okay, so Namibia is, as you've said, looking at a number of vaccine products. One of them is AstraZeneca. Another one is the Sinopharm from China, specifically from Beijing. Another one is the Sputnik 5, as well as the Johnson & Johnson. So we are looking at all these vaccine products. As you've said, they have certain efficacies that one needs to look at. And broadly speaking, efficacy of a vaccine product can range anywhere from 60% to 94%. And I would like to get into the specifics of what these efficacies are for the respective vaccines. But I think what is important for me also to highlight is a misconception amongst the population and even amongst my colleagues in the scientific fraternity, which is that one cannot just extract data on efficacy from these vaccine manufacturers' dossiers and then just compare it, in a linear fashion. There's a number of considerations that need to be taken. For example, looking at the clinical trials that all these vaccine products went through, we have to look at the study participants that were enrolled in the study, what their demographics were. We have to also look at whether the study participants were actually a representative sample of the population in the country where the clinical trial was conducted. We also have to look at how the data, for example, was analyzed, how I'm sorry.
It'll come back to you probably.
Yeah.
It's not a problem.
Yeah. So I think those are the main things, that we have to look at. And that is really generally just to say that there are a number of things that one needs to look at that influence the efficacy.
Okay.
The other thing that I wanted to say, I'm sorry, it just came to me now, was whether or not the study, the clinical trial, the study design that was used was geared to look specifically at efficacy.
Okay.
It's also a very important point to look at again, going back to the study participants, how many study participants were enrolled, because of course the more study participants that are enrolled in the study, the more sort of reliable, if I can call it that, the data analysis would be. So I've said a lot of things now, but I hope that I've achieved my task to explain to you that a lot goes into the definition of efficacy. So now I'm going to use this as an example.
Okay.
We were talking about the different vaccine products.
Yeah.
For example, Pfizer, right? You mentioned that Pfizer has an efficacy of
95%, yeah.
Of 95%. We know that the AstraZeneca, for example, has an efficacy of an efficacy of 64%. In the UK population, right, where the study was conducted, we know that the Sinopharm, for example, has an efficacy of 50.4% in one of the clinical trials that was conducted in I believe it was Brazil. So that was just one clinical trial.
Okay.
The same vaccine, Sinopharm, had an efficacy of roughly 62% in another clinical trial in Indonesia.
Okay.
So you understand,
Yeah.
you know, the what I'm trying to highlight here. It depends on the way that the study was conducted. It depends on the study population and so forth. Looking at the Sputnik 5, I think Sputnik 5 has very remarkable phase 3 clinical trial data, which found an efficacy of 94%.
Yeah.
Yeah. So those are some of the efficacies for the vaccine products that we are looking at. Again, it's important to not just compare them linearly, because you would then compare apples to oranges.
Yeah.
So it's important to also understand the depth of work that went into the clinical trial, and to appreciate what the different characteristics in the population groups and the study design and the analysis of the data was in each of these clinical trials.
And I'm certain that the health ministry would obviously, be looking at this and has a team, your team, looking at this and trying to identify what would be best for us. But I'm curious, if we're not doing our own trials, how do we determine our own efficacy? Because say, for example, let's say Sputnik, right? It has a 90-something% efficacy, but where was the trial done? If it was done mostly in Russia, wouldn't that speak to, let's say, for example, the racial demographic, the age demographic, which would be very different than our demographic? So how do we determine what is actually going to have the highest efficacy for our specific population?
Okay, very good question. So you are correct. Unfortunately, in Namibia, we don't yet have the capacity to conduct our own clinical trials. But what we do have is a very, very stringent regulatory authority whose mandate it is to approve all medicinal pharmaceutical products in this country before they are allowed to be used on the Namibian population. And that regulatory authority is the Namibia Medicines Council. NMRC, the Namibia Medicines Regulatory Council.
Yeah.
So that's really the framework that we have in Namibia in terms of making sure that whatever vaccine that comes into Namibia has been proven to be, first and foremost, very safe, and secondly, efficacious, before we roll it out to the Namibian population. Having said that, it's also important for us to understand that a lot of the data that emanate out of these clinical trials is evolving, right? For example, when these vaccines were manufactured, when the bulk of them were manufactured, we didn't really have the emergence of variants. And of course, the emergence of variants now of COVID-19 has added a different dynamic, to how we respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, and certainly how these vaccines would provide the protection that they need to provide. And so, although a lot is known about the efficacy and safety profiles of the respective vaccine products that we've discussed now, a lot of studies are still ongoing into how these vaccine products veer against many of the variants that are out there. So, I'm saying all of that to say it's an evolving situation, and it makes the work of the team I lead very, very difficult, because on a daily basis we need to evaluate all the new data that is out there and adjust our recommendations and so forth accordingly.
So then, I don't know if this is a question that you can answer just yet, but is there any idea of what Namibia is leaning towards? I'm thinking, for example, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, right? Single dose, doesn't need super cold refrigerators, and works against the South African variant of COVID. So is that something that maybe has stronger considerations for us, given our proximity to South Africa and how it's faring for them? Or, is the ministry still looking at everything else and trying to see if we could potentially accommodate something like AstraZeneca?
Yeah. So, with regards to what the Ministry of Health is looking at, we are not just looking at one vaccine. And why we are not just looking at one vaccine is because we will not be able to vaccinate the target population that we need to vaccinate just with one vaccine product. And that's largely because of the huge demand for these vaccines globally, which is why it's important for the various technical teams on the ministry to make sure that they study the data from the clinical trials very, very stringently to appreciate whether these vaccines can be used in our setting. So we are not just going to be looking at one vaccine. I have mentioned that the Johnson & Johnson is one of the vaccines that we are looking at, looked at, and we hope to procure. Through the COVAX facility, we are going to be getting the AstraZeneca vaccine, which of course has still been proven to be efficacious and safe, especially on protecting against severe disease. And I think that is in my opinion, the most important thing to look at when you are looking at or evaluating efficacy for a specific vaccine, whether or not it is efficacious in preventing severe disease. Because at the end of the day, that is really what is going to put you at risk of being hospitalized, ending up in an ICU, ending up on a ventilator, and that would, of course, also increase your risk of death. In addition to that, that is also what really is going to cripple the health system because of the burden that all these hospitalizations place on the health system.
Yeah.
So it's not just important to look at efficacy against protecting against mild and moderate infection, but more importantly, efficacy against preventing severe disease. And I think that's one of the main things that the technical teams at the Ministry of Health are looking at. Just to sum off, I mentioned, we won't just be looking at one vaccine because of the target population that we want to vaccinate, and that target population is essentially 60 to 80% of the Namibian population. Via the COVAX facility, we will only receive enough doses to vaccinate 20% of that population. So you see, it's important for us also to look at other platforms. So it's an ongoing, very, very stringent process that we are looking at in terms of evaluating efficacy and safety profiles for all these vaccine products, and equally with NMRC, the Namibia Medicines Regulatory Council. It's also an ongoing process for them to get the data, make sure that their teams also stringently go through the data, make sure that they comply to our standards before they are registered in country.
Well, I know that we are expecting to get our first few doses in the next couple of weeks to next couple of months, hopefully, fingers crossed. And there's already somewhat of a rollout plan. Of course, our health professionals will be on the front line of receiving the vaccine, and then that'll be followed by, I'm guessing, the older age demographics, or how exactly is the rollout plan going to work for our population?
Okay, so Namibia has developed a very, very comprehensive national deployment and vaccination plan, which we have submitted to the WHO, and we've received approval from the WHO. Not just that, but they've also commended us on the great work that went into the plan, and they've actually also said that they would use it as a blueprint for other countries. So that's quite a remarkable achievement, I think. In the rollout plan, in the National Deployment and Vaccination Plan, we've addressed a number of things. The population identification of population groups is one of them.
Okay.
So we do have a comprehensive sort of risk stratification scheme of how we are going to target the population groups. And it's important for us to do that, again, because we are not going to receive the required doses of the vaccine that we need to meet our target population. And so it's important for us then to gear our response to make sure that those who are vaccinated first with the initial doses are the ones who are at highest risk of getting severe COVID-19 disease, as well as, of course, our healthcare workers, because they are the ones who are most exposed. Yeah. So some of the target population groups that we've identified, as you've alluded to, are the healthcare workers. Those who are at risk of developing severe disease includes those with pre-existing comorbid conditions.
Yeah.
For example, those with hypertension, diabetes, chronic kidney failure, cancer, the list goes on.
Okay. And children are not included in that demographic, right?
Yes. So children, or essentially anyone below the age of 18 years old,
Okay.
will not be included in this rollout plan. And this is really because we do not have enough data on safety when it comes to this population group.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, having said that, I do know that there is ongoing studies in the UK, I believe, from the University of Oxford, that are looking specifically now at the safety profile of some of these COVID-19 vaccines in children. So I'm quite curious to find out what emanates from that study. But for now, unfortunately, children will not be vaccinated, and really just speaks to the fact that we don't have enough scientific data on the safety profiles.
But as you said, Dr. Kandetu, it's an ongoing study, I think, for the whole world. Everybody's learning as we go along. Studies are being done, and I'm certain that in a couple of months, we'll have the answer to that specific question. But for now, I really do appreciate your insight. I'm sure that our audience does as well. It's good to know that they're not injecting coronavirus into our bodies, and that they won't be putting microchips into our bloodstreams or into our muscles. So thank you so much for taking some time to just break those things down for us. To our audience, thank you very much for tuning in today. I hope that this was an informative session. I'm Arlana Shikongo, and this is the Namibians Heartbeat Livestream.